This week, I talked to Professor Wes Morriston about the Kalam Cosmological argument.
Well, I guess we're interested in the part of the argument for the conclusion that the universe has a cause. And there are two premises. The first premise is that the universe has a beginning, and the second is that anything that begins to exist has a cause. And from that, the conclusion follows.
Right, so it follows via like modus ponens, essentially, from everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the universe begins to exist, that the universe has a cause, right? And so, well, just before we plow into it, do you think, I've always taken it that those two premises and that conclusion is the Kalam cosmological argument.
Well, there's a further argument that the cause of the universe has to be godlike. It's got to be non-temporal, it's got to be non-material, it's got to be incredibly powerful in order to produce such an amazing effect, and so on. And there are some very quick hand-wavy arguments for those conclusions. But maybe we should just focus on what you call the Kalam argument.
Yeah, that seems to be, well, that's how I understand the nomenclature, although not much really hangs on it. It seems to me that Kalam cosmological argument establishes that the universe has a cause, and then there's a subsequent argument that's appended on to the end of that, which you were just outlining then, which says that cause must be God. I don't consider that to be the Kalam, but it doesn't really matter what we call it. We're going to look at that argument anyway, which is those two premises and that conclusion. So you've written a number of papers on this and had you had an exchange in print with Craig, who's the main defender of this argument. And I think also a kind of, well, was it a debate? You mean you met with him publicly and talked about it?
Well, we each gave a short speech, and then we had a conversation in front of an audience at Westminster College. Yeah.
That sounds nice. I like those ones where it's more just a conversation most of the time rather than exchanging ever diminishing amounts of time. And that wasn't recorded, I take it?
It was recorded, but the sound quality and the picture quality were too poor to put it online.
Right. Okay. Well, let's see. So we've got separate things that, so I take it that you object to almost all of the, both premises and the conclusion. At least we can agree that the conclusion follows from the premises. It's at least valid.
No one disputes that.
Good. Okay. So, so let's see. Let's look at reasons why we might challenge the first premise. So the first premise was that everything which begins to exist has a cause. And what do you see to be, well, so first of all, what does Craig say to motivate thinking that that's true in the first place?
Well, the big thing is that something can't pop into existence out of nothing. We're told repeatedly that from nothing, nothing comes. This is, sometimes Craig will put it like this. If there were no God, no space, no time, no nothing, then something couldn't just pop into existence out of that nothing. I find this to be a very strange way of arguing for the premise. If there were absolutely nothing, there would be nothing, not even a popping into existence out of nothing. But that seems like a rather trivial tautology that doesn't entail anything interesting. It certainly doesn't entail that everything that begins to exist has a cause. It's almost as if we're being invited to imagine some black hole of nothingness, and then prior to the existence of time itself, and then out of that something pops. No, there's nothing before there was. If there was nothing, there was just nothing. That's all there is to be said about that. So, I mean, I'm inclined to think that if we charitably interpret this nothing comes from nothing's claim, it's really just a confusing way of saying everything that begins to exist has a cause. And it doesn't really provide the slightest support for that premise. So what else does Craig say to motivate this? Well, he asks us to imagine a raging tiger popping into existence right next to us as we're speaking. And we all agree that that's impossible. A raging tiger couldn't just pop into existence uncaused. And this is supposed to persuade us that we have this a priori intuition that something can't come from nothing, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. I think wouldn't be too difficult to explain why a raging tiger couldn't pop into existence right next to us, because we have a kind of physical context in which stuff like that can't happen. I mean, it isn't terribly, we know a lot about where tigers come from, and this is not the way it happens. So there's a kind of explanation that's perfectly natural, internal to the natural order, of why tigers can't pop into existence uncaused right next to us.
So is this right, that we know what the kind of causal origin circumstances for tigers are, and that's like, another two, male and female tiger or whatever, procreating, and then blah blah blah, like that. Some story like that is what you need to have in order for a tiger to appear, and if there isn't that type of thing going on, then that's why a tiger isn't just going to appear in your front room. I mean, if you've got two tigers in the front room and they procreate, and you come back, I don't know how many months later, there will be a tiger in your room. And if those circumstances are present, then there could be a tiger in your room. But absent those circumstances, that's why a tiger isn't going to appear in the room. Does that characterize what you're saying?
Perfectly.
Right.
We know quite a lot about the necessary and sufficient conditions of tigers coming into existence. I don't think we know anything comparable about the whole natural order. But that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about the alleged coming into existence of the entire natural order, the whole of time.
Yeah, right. And so we don't really know.
I don't know anything about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't really know what that is, even how that's supposed to be. But I mean, is it some kind of weird singularity or something, whatever that is? I don't know, and I certainly don't know what the necessary and sufficient conditions are of the, or even if it makes sense to talk about something like that having the same type of causal circumstances that a thing like a tiger does. It's not clear to me that that's the case. But Craig thinks that this is a fundamental principle of science. Why does he think that?
Because scientists look for causes. I don't think it amounts to any more than that. Something remarkable happens. The scientist doesn't say, oh, well, that's just one of those rare cases where something happened without any cause. The scientist takes that as a problem to be investigated. So they look for causes.
I see. Okay. And so it makes me want to say something like, there are actually there are certain things in science where scientists do say that things happen without a cause, if I understand the science right, like the decay of a radioactive nucleus. That seems to me, I mean, it's within it's something to do with half-lives. You can say statistically how likely it is to decay over the next 5 minutes or something, but exactly why it decays at this particular second rather than some other one, I think they say that that's just an event that doesn't have any cause. Right? Nothing means that it came at this time rather than that time. And if that's right, then that is an event that had no cause, or at least nothing immediately prior to it was both necessary and sufficient for it to happen.
I believe that what Craig says about that is that in such cases you don't have, at least on a certain interpretation of the science, you don't have a sufficient cause, but you do have something. Therefore, you don't just have something popping into existence out of absolutely nothing. There's something there, a quantum vacuum, whatever that is. There's something there. That's at least a necessary condition of the occurrence of the event. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure that that is a knockdown counterexample to the principle that everything has some sort of cause. Everything that comes to be has some sort of cause.
Okay, so I also think, and I'm curious to see what you think about this, but it also seems to me some sort of strange, perverse way of looking at this sort of fundamental principle in science, right? I guess, in a sense, everything, all these things around us, this mug and this phone and stuff, they all have causes for their existence, I guess, if we can speak like that. That's true. And so someone might say, oh, well, it's just an inductive inference from like everything that you've seen to this other thing, which is the universe, because you've never seen anything that didn't have a cause. Why suppose that the universe didn't have a cause? Isn't that sort of perverse or something? But then the thought would be, well, all of those things that we just talked about, the phone and the cup and the table and stuff, all the causes that they had were all in the universe. They were all physical things. So it's already not, so when they're saying, oh yeah, but you have to just assume that the universe had a cause, but not, not physical cause, not a cause, unlike all of those other causes that you've seen, right? So it's already not the same type of inference. We're going from a bunch of cases that have physical causes or sort of natural causes or something, and we're supposed to be able to infer from all of those that something has a supernatural cause or non-physical cause. So the two cases seem quite distinct there. I mean, does that seem fair to you?
I do think that's right. I mean, it seems like occurring within the natural order is a relevant difference. In the other case, we just land on air. But Craig does talk as if there's great inductive support for this premise of his argument. He makes it sound as if it's a straightforward enumerative induction. We always find causes, therefore there always is a cause, or something like that. Of course, we don't always find causes, but even if we did, it's not clear that that we're justified in making that leap, that there's enough relevant similarity between the cases that we're interested in, namely the whole shebang, the entire, not just the universe, but the whole of physical reality for however long it's ever existed, the entire natural order. Why we should make that leap is really unclear to me. It's also the case that there are many other inductive inferences that one could make. If one could make this one, there are a bunch of others that aren't nearly so favorable to the case that Craig wants to make. He believes in creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. How many times have we observed anything being created out of nothing? Isn't it the case that every time we see anything come into being, it's coming into being out of something and not just produced by someone? So that would be one example, but there are many others. How many cases of incorporeal minds producing this or that have we observed? Zero is what I would say, and so on and so forth. So if he does go down this road, I'm inclined to say that there are a great many other inductive inferences that he should be making as well, and a lot of them would undermine the overall case that he wants to make.
Yeah, so it seems like we could say something like the real, I mean, maybe, right? It seems like this is at least symmetrical, that the real kind of fundamental principle of science is that when you've got some phenomenon and you're looking for what its cause is, you don't say, well, maybe a mind that exists without a brain that has superpowers just made it creation ex nihilo. That the fundamental principle of science is that you don't appeal to those types of explanations, but you look for some kind of run-of-the-mill mechanistic, maybe materialistic or something, at least some kind of mechanism underneath it that explains it. You don't just say maybe a kind of supernatural personal entity just made it by having immense power. I mean, so, but I would suppose that seems more likely to be the fundamental principle of science than simply that nothing can pop into existence without a cause, which is how he supposes.
Well, even if we're not methodological materialists, and even if we're dualists, mind-body dualists, we've not encountered any cases of minds that are not, as it were, attached to bodies in whatever way minds are attached to bodies. So we haven't encountered any cases of incorporeal things producing results.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I do find, maybe I've just thought about this in the same way for too long, but I do find that first premise, while it sounds plausible on its face, everything that begins to exist has a cause, because you can point to lots of things around you and say, oh, that began to exist and it had a cause, that began to exist and it had a cause. It sort of seems plausible, but when you start pulling at it philosophically like we've done, it really seems very weak indeed to place much weight on it.
I do think it's weak. I think that advocates of the Kalam argument would be better off treating it as an argument to the best explanation. So they would start out with this amazing jaw-dropping fact that the whole shebang has a beginning. And I say, why? Now let's consider possible explanations. Isn't it more likely given God than, well, given whatever? Can you even think of an alternative explanation? I'm not sure that'd be a good argument, but I think it would be far superior to think of it that way than to say, well, we've just got this a priori intuition that everything that comes to be has to have a cause, which is proved by the fact that things don't pop into existence out of nothing, and everybody knows that. But that is, in fact, it's the top-down way that the argument is always seems to be run.
Well, I suppose. Well, on the one hand, it's quite easy to say. It's very simple. The two premises and the conclusion. Anybody can remember that, and it's a deductive argument. So I suppose the idea would be that it compels you towards the conclusion as strongly as possible, whereas an abductive argument, maybe it's less it's easier to make, like you were saying. You can sort of make it sound more plausible, but there's always that wiggle room because it's not a deductive argument.
Oddly, though, I mean, Craig always tries to make his burden of proof as low as possible. So he tries to persuade you that each of his premises is more plausible than its denial. And that's all he officially claims. This is more, surely you'll agree that this is more plausible than the denial. Well, that doesn't get you awfully far towards saying that you have a slam dunk argument for the truth of the conclusion. It moves you in that direction if you think that both of his premises are more plausible than their conclusion. So you might end with a slightly higher credence for the conclusion than you began with. But if that's all he's going to say, then this particular deductive argument doesn't have any great advantage over the abductive way of going about it.
I mean, we're going slightly off topic here, I guess, but I mean, that idea of the premises being more plausible than their negations. So if we give it a credence that's greater than the credence we give its negation, if that's all that you say about the argument, then it's quite easy to find premises that you could string together which are very close to being 0.5, although greater than 0.5. But because they're quite close to 0.5, they multiply together, and the probability of the conclusion can only be assumed to be, it doesn't establish that the probability of the conclusion is high, right? Those probabilities sort of multiply together.
It gives you a lower bound, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
For the conclusion.
So moved to say,
which might still be pretty low. I mean, you could have premises that are both quite a bit greater than 0.5 and multiply them, and you'd still have a conclusion that's, you know, you'd have a lower bound, but the lower bound could well below 0.5.
Yeah.
Assuming that the premises are completely independent, as these are.
So he's moved now to saying that the good argument is one where it establishes that the conclusion is more probable than its negation.
I'm not sure that he says precisely that, but he does think it's a good argument because A, the conclusion follows from the premises, and because B, each of the premises is more plausible than its denial.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so let's move on, I think, to premise 2, right, which is where most of the stuff that we want to talk about takes place, I think. So premise 2 is simply just that the universe began to exist. And it seems to me that there's 2 types of support for this. One is stuff from physics about the, Big Bang model and that type of thing. And then there's a couple of sort of philosophical arguments as well. I'm quite happy if you want to say something about the physics. I'm certainly not qualified to say anything competent about physics.
Well, I'm not qualified to say anything about it either, so that makes 2 of us.
Okay, great. Well, it doesn't stop Craig saying stuff about the physical support.
Well, I'd be willing to grant that he's more qualified than I am, but I doubt that he's more qualified than the physicists I've asked about it. So, and they leave me with the impression that we just don't know enough about the so-called early universe to say the things Craig thinks we should say.
Yeah,
we don't know how far back the laws, the laws of physics as we know them extend, with density and temperatures that are off the charts. The laws we have no longer apply. There's a riot of speculation about it, but there's certainly no scientific consensus. So I'm inclined to think that we should be agnostic about all that.
And I'm at least aware enough to know that there's a big problem in physics about how to relate relativity and quantum mechanics. And so any speculation that we draw from our current understanding of physics, it seems like there's good reason to suppose that our understanding at the fringes that these things could change. So even if it follows that on our best current understanding of physics, the universe had to have a beginning, I still think that that's a sort of thing that could come apart, say, with whatever it is that unifies those 2 theories together, some string theory or some other random theory that we don't know about yet. That might overturn the fact that, I don't know, for all I know, that before the Big Bang, there was some other state of affairs that is described by a different theory, which unifies relativity and quantum mechanics. So without me needing to know much more than that, it seems to me, we just know that there's some kind of uncertainty. We don't really know enough about the physics to say anything absolutely sure, it seems to me.
That's certainly how it seems to me.
Okay, good. Well, let's leave that to one side then. Maybe you can explain for us so it seems to me that there's 2, broadly speaking, 2 different philosophical arguments that Craig raises to establish that the universe had a beginning. So maybe you could just outline those 2 arguments for us, or you could pick one and we can look at that and then move on to the next one.
Well, why don't we begin with the general argument against the actual infinite? Um, the thought is that the past must have a beginning, or rather, a series of discrete, successive past events must have a beginning, a very first member of the series. And why is that? Well, because this would be an actual infinite. The events in a beginningless series have a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, or if you prefer, the negative integers. How many of those are there? Well, the first transfinite number, Aleph naught, is the answer. So that would be an example of what Craig calls an actual infinite. An actual infinite is defined as a set that has the same number of members as one of its proper subsets. Indeed, an actual infinite has the same number as infinitely many proper subsets. And that would be the case with a beginningless past. So if you can show that no actual infinite is possible in the real world, then you have shown, so the argument goes, that the past can't be beginningless. There has to be a very first event. Does that sound about right to you?
I think so, yeah. And Craig's going to use that principle. So that definition for the actual infinite, which is that the members of an actual infinite can be placed in a one-to-one correspondence with a proper subset of it, like the natural numbers can be placed in a one-to-one correspondence with the even numbers, right? And that's a kind of weird counterintuitive property, but that's just what infinite numbers are like, right?
Or with the odd numbers, or with all the numbers greater than 3, or all the numbers greater than 4, and so on.
Yeah. So infinite or transfinite numbers have this property, which we can call Cantor's property. And Craig basically thinks that that property manifests results that are unacceptable for metaphysical reasons. Does that seem right?
Yes. His favorite way of arguing for this conclusion is that Hilbert's hotel is impossible. Hilbert's hotel, as you know, is an infinite hotel. The rooms in the hotel, there's a one-to-one correspondence between them and the natural numbers. So there's room number 1, room number 2, room number 3, and so on. The hotel is completely full. There is exactly one guest in each room. And the hotel has this amazing property that, in principle, you could remove infinitely many guests. You could make room for a new guest by having the infinitely many guests shift to the room with their number plus 1. So then room number 1 would be available for a new guest. You could make room for infinitely many new guests by having everyone move to the room with double their present number. So the guest in room number 1 goes to room number 2, the guest in room number 2 goes to room number 4, and so on. And voila, you have room for infinitely many new guests. Or Craig is very troubled by the fact that you could remove infinitely many guests from the hotel in one way and virtually empty the hotel. All the guests, say in rooms numbered 4 and greater, leave, and you only have 3 guests left. The hotel is virtually empty. On the other hand, you could have all the even numbered guests leave, and the hotel would, at the end of that process, have infinitely many guests. Now, we're supposed to be thinking such a hotel is not just physically impossible, it's metaphysically impossible. I mean, these implications are absurd. There could be no such thing in the real world. What's wrong with the hotel? Well, it's infinite. That's what's wrong with it. It's an actual infinite. The argument at this point really has two premises and a conclusion. One, if an actual infinite is possible, then a Hilbert's hotel would be possible. Two, a Hilbert's hotel is not possible, therefore an actual infinite is not possible. I think that pretty well sums up the argument. Now, why shouldn't we be persuaded that this immediately shows that a beginningless series of past events is not possible? I think the first thing to consider is that while it's true that you can combine actual infinity with other properties to get very counterintuitive results, it doesn't immediately follow that an actual infinite is impossible. So what makes for the absurd implications in the case of the Hilbert's hotel is the fact that the guests can be moved. Well, let's think of a different actual infinite, namely the beginningless series of past events. The events can't be moved out of their temporal locations. So already there's a clear disanalogy between the Hilbert's hotel and the beginningless series of past events. Now I think that, so one might wonder, well, it's combining actual infinity with movability or something that creates the problem in the case of a Hilbert's hotel, but you don't get a similar problem in the case of a beginningless series of past events. So what might one say in response to that if one's defending the Kalam argument? I think the obvious response would be to say, oh, well, it isn't, you can't actually move events out of their temporal locations, but you can imagine that it might have been different in certain ways. I mean, it might have been the case that, if the events are numbered, it might have been that all the even numbered ones didn't occur. Or it might have been that all the ones earlier than the third one from the present didn't occur. And then you would get the difficulty about subtracting infinity from infinity and getting a finite result in one case and an infinite result in the other case. And so you get the same sorts of difficulties without the assumption that you can actually move events around in their time slots once they've happened. So I think that's roughly where defenders of the Kalam argument would go in response to this first bit of dialectic.
Mm-hmm. And so what's your response then to that? So let me see if I've got that right. So the idea was that there could be this infinite hotel, say, but it only really manifests anything that we could call absurd if it has this property of being able to move things around in it, right? But if it always had its doors locked or something, then though it would be infinite in extent, it wouldn't actually manifest any of these absurd results. Like you wouldn't be able to take away infinite number of guests and leave an infinite number behind, or take away infinite number of guests and leave 3 behind. So, and those are the things which we're supposed to find absurd. It's not just the fact that there's a hotel with infinite rooms in it that's absurd. It's the fact that it manifests this behavior. So the idea is if you could stop these things happening, then what you'd be left with is a very strange hotel, but not anything that you could call absurd. And that seems to be the sort of pivot that Craig's using. And then the reply to that is to say, well, even if there was such a passive object that was infinite in extent but never manifested any absurd behavior, because you could imagine it manifesting that behavior, that's enough to make it absurd anyway. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. So if you can imagine it, you could imagine the doors having been unlocked. Say they were locked and you couldn't move. Well, you can imagine them being unlocked. It's a little bit harder in the case of a beginningless series of past events because the doors really couldn't have been unlocked.
Mm.
Once on the view of time that Craig takes, certainly, once it's happened, and there's no undoing it. So the events are locked into the temporal slots that they occupy, and there's no way to imagine it having, right, there's no way of imagining that they could have been moved around, but you could imagine the whole series having been different. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think that it seems natural to think of the times that things happen being sort of like containers into which you put the events that happen at them, and that means that you'd say something like, look, so if I said, oh, let's imagine that we swapped 1917 with 2017, right? We take all the events that happened in 2017 and move them back down the timeline and move so a little bit of First World War Europe switches over and occupies the time that's happening now. And all this stuff that's going on now, our conversation, that actually happens in 1917 instead. I think that what you would have done then would be just to make a very strange looking timeline, right, where the causal lines kind of stop and they're not very well ordered. But what you wouldn't have done would be to actually move 1917 to 2017. But 2017 can't be moved. You could change what happens at 2017, but its identity is basically determined by its place in the timeline, and that's why it doesn't make any sense. I'm not sure. So I feel like I want to say you could maybe imagine moving guests around in the hotel, but when it comes to time, you can't actually imagine changing the times from having different locations. You might be able to imagine moving the events around. It's something like changing the guests could occupy different rooms, but the rooms themselves are fixed where they are when it comes to time. And I think that's behind why people say that you can't move times around, why they're metaphysically fixed or something. Does that seem right?
Well, I think you could imagine every other event not having occurred. So there'd be a gap, maybe something else happens in between, but I need to make this a little clearer by imagining a particular series. One that I like is to imagine an angel that's always existed without any beginning, having at regular intervals said some sort of praise, some sort of praise of God or whatever. So there's this beginningless series of praises, and we can think of them in one-to-one correlation with the natural numbers, and we can imagine the series might have been different. It might have been that he skipped every other one of the praises, or it might be that he skipped, that he didn't do any until 3 moments ago, or it might, and that way we would generate conclusions that Craig regards as absurd, I think.
Okay, so
whether they're really absurd is another question. But I think it would, thinking about it that way, you would generate implications that are comparable in some way to the Hilbert's Hotel and the untoward implications of Hilbert's Hotel.
Okay, good. So what that seems to show then is that, well, you might want to say there's a disanalogy between the hotel example and the time example, because even if you could move the guests around, you couldn't really move the events around. But maybe we'll say that you can, just being able to imagine doing so counts.
Imagining it all having been different, I think is what one would have to say. You can't have it that it's first one way and then it's changed to another way, as you can with the Hilbert's Hotel. But you'd have to imagine the whole beginningless series having been different. in
Yeah.
various ways.
Yeah.
And if you can pull that off, then maybe you could get these absurd implications, or at least allegedly absurd implications.
Right. And so you have a response to this, which is to imagine is a kind of tweaking of that example then, with the angel saying praises, going towards the future. Is that right?
That's right. First, let me say that the one thing that one way one might respond to this is just to say, well, the infinite is different from the finite. Yeah, it's weird. It has these implications, but there's nothing to say about this except the infinite collections are very different from finite ones. And that is what, in the last analysis, I'd be inclined to say. But in support of that, I want to say that an endless future is possible. And I don't think that most advocates of the Kalam argument are all inclined to deny that. And not only is an endless future possible, but we could generate implications that are exactly parallel to the allegedly absurd implications that are generated by the thought of a beginningless series of past events. So imagine a couple of angels, let's call them Gabriel and Uriel, who are taking turns praising God forever. So Gabriel, let's say, does the odd-numbered praises and Uriel does the even-numbered ones. So first, Gabriel says a praise that lasts one celestial minute, or whatever interval we choose, and then it's followed by a second praise by Uriel, and then praise number 3 is said by Gabriel, and so on. For every n, there's another praise, an n+1 praise, said by one or the other of these two angels. Now, I ask, how many praises are such that they will be said by these angels? Well, for every n, there will be an nth praise. How many is that? Well, it's exactly the same as the number for a beginningless past, namely the first transfinite cardinal. We've got the same one-to-one correlation with the natural numbers. So we've got the same number of future praises. We get the same strange implications. What if God, say, had prevented all of Uriel's praises? Well, we've taken away infinitely many praises, so to speak. How many are still on schedule? Infinitely many. What if God had prevented all the praises after praise number 3? Well, how many praises are still on schedule? 3. How many have been taken away? Infinitely many. So you've got the problem of transfinite arithmetic, of inverse arithmetical operations that Craig says yield contradictions in the case of this infinite series. You could make room for infinitely many praises by another angel, by various devices, having this or that praise prevented, and so on. So what's the answer to this? Well, Craig's answer is, oh, you're wrong. It's only potentially infinite. The series of these praises is only a potential infinity. What's that? Well, no matter how far along you go in the series, only finitely many praises will have been said. And so you're continually increasing the series of praises that have been said, moving toward infinity as a limit. I think that's the way he puts it. But the key thing is that at every stage, only finitely many praises have been said. Well, I guess I'm not persuaded by this. It's true that at every stage, only finitely many praises will have been said. And it's also true that one will never, Gabriel and Uriel will never have finished praising. So there's no point, there's no infinite point in the future at which they will have finished. That makes no sense. But so what? I still want to ask, how many are in the series, each of which will be said? And it seems to me that when I ask this question, I'm asking a question that is exactly comparable to the question that one asks when one talks about a beginningless series of praises. How many praises are such that each of them has been said? Well, we've got a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, don't we? Well, how many praises are such that each of them will be said? Well, we've got a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers again. I don't see any relevant difference between the two cases. There is an asymmetry, right? All the praises in the beginningless series have been said. There will never be any time at which all the praises in the endless series will have been said. But that asymmetry isn't relevant to the question that I'm asking, which is how many are such that each of them will be said. And I simply don't see why the answer isn't the first transfinite cardinal. But then we get all the same allegedly very absurd implications. So maybe they aren't as absurd as we thought.
And Craig doesn't want to.
I would be inclined to say an endless series is clearly possible. So if you've got these implications in that case, then they can't be as absurd as you claim.
He doesn't want to bite the bullet and say, all right then, so the future must have an end as well, right? Because that would be one way out of it.
Well, Craig certainly does not want to do that. I have talked to people who like the Kalam argument, who are prepared to say, oh yes, and time has to come to an end, and there must be a very last praise, and but that is not the typical view. And I can't prove that I'm right about this, but it does not seem to me that people who believe in the life everlasting, where that consists in an endless series of adventures, one after another, are believing something that's impossible. It may not be true, but I don't see any reason to say that it's metaphysically impossible. Nor do I think that we have any reason to think that a beginningless series is metaphysically impossible.
Or at least that this consideration isn't sufficient to rule out either of those two.
Certainly Hilbert's hotel type considerations are not sufficient. I mean, I think what it all comes down to is that there are three propositions that are, that we have a problem with. The first is that there's a one-to-one correspondence between an infinite set and its proper, infinitely many of its proper parts, so to speak. A second is that if there's a one-to-one correspondence between two sets, then the number of elements in those sets is the same. And the third is that an infinite set is possible. And, Cantor famously, held all three of those things. And, some people think, well, there's a problem there. And you can't really hold all three of those things. You have to give up one of them. Craig wants to give up the claim that an infinity is possible.
So does the question just come down to whether or not, so that principle, which is that essentially that the whole is greater than the part or something, which is called Euclid's maxim sometimes. That is true of finite sets, and it's not true of transfinite sets. And the question is just whether or not, it seems to me the question is whether or not Euclid's maximum is true of the actual world. I mean, if it's not true of the actual world, then there just can be some portion of the actual world which is equal in extent, in its parts can be lined up in one-to-one correlation with the whole. And if that's right, then he's just wrong to appeal to that. So, I mean, the absurdities that he's appealing to are just weird features of the way that the world actually is. Like if someone said, oh, I've got this principle, which is that, something like things can have both a definite position and a definite momentum at the same time, right? And that's my principle that I hold to. Then they would be ruling out quantum mechanics a priori, because that's basically the uncertainty principle, one version of that, which is that these systems can't have a definite value for both of those two properties. And you might say, well, it's absurd that there would be a particle that could, if it had a definite momentum, didn't have a definite position. Like, that's absurd. So that couldn't happen. Yet it does happen. There just happens to be. That's the theory which we think is true. And I don't remember any a priori metaphysicians waving their hands and saying, no, quantum mechanics needs to be abandoned on that principle, right? Even though it sounds quite intuitive. And isn't that all we're doing here? It just seems to me like maybe in some weird distant part of the universe, there is a Hilbert's hotel. And maybe if you ask them, they will shuffle up and make a room for you. And maybe that's there, I don't know. But it'd be weird to rule it out just on the basis that it seems weird, right?
I'd say something like that. I think the world would have to be very different from what it is for there to be a Hilbert's hotel, probably. What's at stake is not whether this is physically possible, but whether it's metaphysically possible.
Well, I'm not sure what the difference.
Hard to get a handle on that.
Yeah, I've never understood what the difference between those is supposed to be in any kind of rigorous way. I mean,
well, the thought is that the laws of nature could have been different.
Yeah, but then I think that they could have been different, and the only thing that limits them would be consistency, maybe. Even then, I'm not sure that that's a proper limit. Yeah. But I mean, so I want to say something like, let's assume that there's a logical possibility, some kind of boundary that we can't go beyond. Then, yeah, sure, the laws of physics could have been different in any of the logically coherent ways of describing possible laws of physics. There isn't anything in between the laws of physics and the laws of logic, let's say, which is the laws of metaphysics. I mean, I'm not sure. Well, is that what we're supposed to hold? That there are some metaphysically possible ways the laws of physics could have been, and some metaphysically impossible ways the laws of physics could have been. I mean, I lose track here of what's making the decisions about those things.
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. Okay, well, so Hilbert's hotel, then, we think that this example basically boils down to just not much more than saying that it seems weird to imagine. And with your case of the angels, it makes it seem like if you want to be like Craig and hold that the future is in fact endless, given the endless afterlife or something, that you can cook up an example like you did, which displays all of the same seemingly weird behavior. It's as weird as Hilbert's hotel is anyway. And if it's unacceptable for Hilbert's hotel, it should also be unacceptable for this.
We should probably make note of another bit of the dialectic. When Craig does consider the precise question that I mean to be asking, how many events, each of which will occur in a series like the one I've described, he says that there are none, because he thinks that the future does not exist. He's a presentist who thinks only present things exist in the full-blooded, some very heavy-duty sense of exists. Only the present exists. So he'll say that the answer is none. And my response to that, I can keep it pretty brief. I mean, what if God had set up a mechanism such that Gabriel and Uriel would say one praise per minute, alternate praises per minute for an hour? Would it not be possible for us to say that they will do 30 praises each if they're 1 minute praises? And would we say that the answer to the question, how many praises each of which will be said, is 0 or none, because there are no such praises? I don't think any presentist wants to go there. And in fact, when Craig's talking about past events, which he also doesn't think exist, he has no problem saying how many US presidents there have been, and how many years it's been since the Big Bang, and so on and so forth. So, and in general, he has no problem referring to or quantifying over future or past events, despite their alleged non-existence. So I don't see how, I don't see how he can forbid me to say things like, for every n, it will be the case that one or the other of these angels says an nth praise. And if he allows me to say that, then I've got what I'm looking for.
It seems like a really elementary mistake as well, because so in that case where each of them alternates every minute for an hour, you say, well, how many praises will Gabriel say? The answer is 30. The answer to which it would be correct for a presentist to say 0, the question to which that would be a correct answer would be something like, how many future praises are there where Gabriel says a praise or something in that upcoming hour? And he'll say, well, there aren't any now, because I don't believe my ontology doesn't include future events.
Right.
There aren't any. But that's not, if the question is, how many will there be, then the answer has to be 30, right? Because it's the difference between how many are there and how many will there be. How many future events are there and how many events will there be? They're just two different questions. And yet it's correct to say that the presentist answers, there are no future events. But he doesn't say there will be no future events, unless he thinks that this is the end of everything, right? Judgment Day or something. Only at that point is it correct for the presentist to say there will be no future events.
I think even if, suppose we imagine the case this way. Suppose they take turns for an hour saying 1 minute praises. And I ask the question, and those are the only praises they will ever say. Now, what's the answer to the question, how many will they ever say? The answer is 60 in total, 30 each. If I'm allowed to say that in answer to the question, how many will they ever say, on the scenario where they do it for an hour, taking turns saying 1 minute praises, then why am I not allowed to say, well, if they're going to do this forever, then there's a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, and so the answer is infinitely many. But of course, that is exactly the argument for saying that a beginningless series of past praises would be infinite. One-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, therefore infinitely many have been said. I mean, the fact that they all have been said is not a premise of the argument, really. I mean, it's just, the argument is just there's a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, therefore infinitely many.
And as a good presentist, surely he should say how many, if you're going to say, if the answer to how many future praises are there is 0, then the same answer should be given for how many past praises are there. There should also be 0, even if it's been going on forever, because as a presentist, he doesn't believe in future events, but he also doesn't believe in past events. Right? So
I think the line is that it's not 0 because they have been said.
But that seems better than the question, because you could say, well, the answer shouldn't be 0 because they will be said, right? Unless you say that the asymmetry matters, it's unclear why saying the word have with heavy breath or something makes any difference.
Well, that is how it seems to me. I mean, the way he says it with heavy breath, as it were, is to say, well, they have been said, so they're part of the actual world. Whereas future events are pure potentialities that have not yet been actualized. So I guess we can, count events that are part of the actual world? As far as I can see, this is just a verbal sleight of hand. They have been said, so they're part of the actual world. I don't see that, but they don't really exist. Why don't I say, well, each of these will be said, not may or may not be said, but will be said. So they are therefore part of the actual world.
Yeah, it's true now that they will be said, right? So that's all you need. And so in order to stop that, Craig could say, well, maybe it's not true now, right? Maybe there aren't any truths about these sorts of things. But the point is that that's not his view about the future. He thinks God knows things now, and that means that they're true now.
That's right. I mean, an open future person who thinks that there are truth value gaps might say, oh, here's how it is. Gabriel may or may not say the first praise. Uriel may or may not say the second. Gabriel may or may not, if the first two are said, Gabriel may or may not say the third, and that's all we can say. That's the whole truth about the matter. Well, okay, but that is not Craig's view. For him, there's a fact of the matter about what will happen. Always.
So the thing is that there are escape routes. Like we said, you could bite the bullet and just say, all right, well, there must be the argument is symmetric and it proves that there must be a final moment. And okay, so you can wriggle out of this. But the point is that Craig has to give up. He has to give up something that he's committed to. Now, he's a Molinist, so he thinks that God knows future truths now. So the kind of resort to presentism and the asymmetry that he wants to include doesn't really work if he also holds to Molinism. I mean, there's an asymmetry in Molinism between the past and the future, but it's not between whether or not there's a truth about the future as opposed to the past. There is a truth about the future and a truth about the past on Molinism. So it doesn't seem like he's able to avoid your criticism. But what does he say? Because you've put this to him in person, and he replied to your paper where you make this objection. And I'll link the correspondence, your paper and his reply, and then your reply to that in the description so other people can see it. But what's his reply when you make this kind of move?
He continually reverts to the thought that it has to be a merely potential infinite. That's his main line. And he thinks that I have completely ignored or not taken into account the importance of tense. The entire argument is cast in terms of a tensed version of time, according to which there's a fact of the matter about what is going on now, and an objective fact of the matter, an ever-changing fact of the matter about what's now, what will be, what has been. And he thinks that I've failed to take this into account, and that when you do take it into account, you see that any future series such as the one I've envisaged is a merely potential infinite. And there's a point at which I've just felt that I was beating my head against a wall. I feel that he's just not quite seeing what I'm seeing. And I don't know why.
So I don't think that it could be that you're not taking account of tense, because you can make the claim in a tensed language by just saying how many praises will there be, and you don't have to say how many events that are later than this one are timelessly true that Gabriel is saying the praise or something. You don't have to say it in a tenseless way. So it can't be the difference between tense and tenseless, and that you haven't taken account of tense.
That is an important distinction. I mean, I think that Craig readily concedes that an eternalist who thinks that all points on the timeline are sort of on a par ontologically would have to say that that the past is infinite if and only if the future is. I mean, that they would be exactly on a par in this respect. But he thinks that if, given the objectivity of temporal becoming, there's this asymmetry between the two cases. And the asymmetry really just comes to this. All the past events have happened. It will never be the case that all the future events have happened, because they're in an endless future, because there will still be events yet to come. That's the asymmetry, and that drives his intuition that this has got to be a merely potential infinite.
But I feel like that's not an asymmetry, right? Because, of course, it's true that, let's say, if, like right now, assuming the past was infinite, you'd say, how many events have happened? And the answer is going to be infinitely many. And if you start counting now, so either 1, 2, 3, at any point, if you ask me how many, how far have you counted, my answer is always going to be a finite amount. So in one sense, the past looks like it's different to the future. That's true. But that seems like I can just come up with a reversed version of that. So if somebody was counting down till now, and then continued to count onwards, and you just ask the same question, but the tense is the other way around. I mean, at any point, if you ask, well, how many numbers is he about? Is he still going to count? The answer is going to be an infinite number. But then if you ask the question, at any point in the past, how many numbers did he yet have to count before he would get to me? It will be a finite number. So this going backwards into the past, now I've switched everything around, is a potential infinite, but the future is an actual infinite. Right? So tense doesn't make the difference between the past and the future. What makes the difference, what makes the asymmetry, is just him saying that the past is different to the future because it's asymmetric. And you have to put that in. Tense itself is symmetric. You have to say something else about, well, there's this present moment and it moves in this direction, not in that direction. Right? And that's what the asymmetry is. But all of those facts about where things are on the timeline, you can express them in tenses. And I think that it's just not true that there's an asymmetry that comes out of tense. So it seems to me the difference can't be, well, if you talk about tenses, then it immediately follows that there's this asymmetry. It's just if you prioritize the past ontologically over the future, then there's an asymmetry. But that's just by building in an asymmetry, it seems to me anyway. And that's not tenses don't give you that the past is different to the future.
I think he thinks the asymmetry is, I see what you're saying, but I think he thinks this asymmetry is just built into the warp and woof of time itself.
Yeah, I think that's true, but that's different from saying that it's built into tense, because often those things are smudged together. But it's difficult for me to accept that Craig is making that mistake, because
he accused me of not taking tense seriously. But yeah, it's not just tense.
Yeah. It would be better if he said that you're not taking temporal passage seriously or something. Right?
It's as if reality itself is changing. I mean, this whole presentist view is very confusing to me. I mean, how wide is the present? What is it that's really changing?
Exactly.
How are we to think about these things that don't exist, but that we nevertheless talk about and know truths about? I mean, I think presentists have a lot of work to do, and there's a bewildering variety of views out there. But I think he thinks the asymmetry is just built into this ever-changing reality, which drops things off into the non-existent past and, carries us into the future.
Okay, so maybe this is a good point to move on to the last argument, which is about successive addition, because it seems like this argument is rooted in what we were just talking about there with this asymmetry that Craig holds. So maybe you can outline this second argument.
Well, I mean, a temporal series is formed by successive addition, by one element being added to all the previous ones. But the claim is that no series formed by successive addition can be an actual infinite. If that's right, then no temporal series can be an actual infinite, so the series of past events cannot be an actual infinite. But a beginningless series of past events would be an actual infinite, so it's out for that reason. I may not have exactly quoted him, but I think that's the gist of the argument. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. So premise one is, let's say that time, the past series of times, is formed by successive addition. Second premise is no series which is formed by successive addition can be actually infinite, like can't be completed. And then from those two things, it follows that the past series of events, the time leading up to here, couldn't be an actual infinite. It could never get completed.
Yeah.
Okay, so I take it that you don't deny the second premise, which is that, I mean, you're not going to say, well, actually, yeah, you could keep adding one thing to a pile and eventually you'd have infinitely many things. I take it you're not going to deny that.
No. Of course.
So you must be denying the first premise then, right? Which is that that the past series of events is a successive addition, was formed by successive addition, let's say.
Most of the argument in the literature has been about whether a beginningless series could be formed by successive addition.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's fair to say that that's where most of the action is, and that's what I've thought the most about. Now, why couldn't it be? And what is it to be formed by successive addition anyway? Suppose we have a fairly light understanding of what that means. Suppose it just means that each of the events in the series has been added to all those that had already occurred. And as long as that is true, the series is formed by successive addition. I guess I think if that's all that formed by successive addition means, then I myself find it very difficult to see why a beginningless series couldn't be formed by successive addition. Now, why does he think it couldn't be? Well, the first big line of argument seems to be that before the present event could arrive, the one before that would have to have arrived, and before that, the one before that would have had to arrive, and so on ad infinitum. So we'd never arrive at the present, or something would never arrive at the present. I'm just baffled by this argument. It seems to me the response to the argument on behalf of the person who thinks the past has no beginning is simply to say, well, guess what? All of them have arrived. Right? You're saying that a necessary condition of the present having arrived is that the event that occurred a moment ago have arrived. Well, guess what? It did. You're saying it's a necessary condition of the one that happened a moment ago to have arrived, that the one before that have arrived. Well, guess what? It did. And so on for each one of them throughout the beginningless series. What is the problem supposed to be? I just don't see any problem here. I mean, Craig always says, well, we're driven back and back and back into infinity. It's as if, well, it seems like a confusion. I mean, you're driven back and back. If you're foolishly looking for the very first one in a beginningless series of events, you won't find it. That's true. That has no implications at all for that interest us here. If you're saying, well, you can't count all the events in a beginningless series, well, no, you can't count back through all of them. But that doesn't mean they can't be there. It can't have been there. So this argument just seems to me to be, I mean, it has to be assumed somewhere in the argument that these previous events can't have arrived. There are too many of them or something. But why should we assume that? If we assume that, we're just begging the question against the beginningless past.
Right. So the thought is that if you were to add things, so if we start now at this point, and I say, okay, 1, 2, and I add successively one number onto the pile of numbers I'm counting, at any point, if I stop and check how many numbers I've counted, it will be a finite amount. Right? So this is a potentially infinite, but not actually infinite series. And Craig's idea, which we agree with, is that adding one like this to a series like in that manner never gets you to infinity, right?
Yep.
And okay, great. So then the idea is that he says, but if you were to go back, counting down, I suppose, so starting at 0 and then saying -1, -2, -3, blah blah blah, then you would never get to minus infinity either. So that shows you that. Well, is that supposed to show you then that successive subtraction never gets you to infinity? I mean, okay, that seems right as well. But the thought would be, if
you start at a point, you never arrive at a point infinitely distant from that point.
Yes, right, exactly. But then the beginningless, the whole point of the beginningless past hypothesis is that there is no beginning point.
There is no beginning point, exactly.
Yeah, so there's no point at which you start counting. And
that's the hypothesis that he's supposed to be reducing to absurdity.
But to do that, he has to start counting backwards from here, right? And it seems to me that all that shows is what the second premise showed, which was successive addition never gets you to infinity.
Yeah, I could never succeed in counting backwards through all of them. The series really is beginningless. But
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So what? I mean, that's like saying there have to be only finitely many numbers because I can't finish counting all of them.
Yeah, and
it's as if we were confusing the counting activity with what's to be counted, what's there to be counted.
Yeah, excellent, great. That's the distinction.
He also does a number on an infinite counter who's counting, what should I say, up. He's counting all the negative numbers. He's always been counting out the negative numbers, and he's finishing the count, -3, -2, -1. I guess he adds 1. at each stage of the count. And
Mm-hmm.
he says, well, if a beginningless past were possible, then an infinite counter like that would be possible. But here's the problem with the infinite counter. He should have finished before now because he's had enough time, right? He's saying -1 now, but he could have been getting to -1 a moment ago because, right, he's had infinite time to do this in. In fact, he should have done it before any given time. Therefore, there's no time at which he's doing any counting. And allegedly, the hypothesis of the infinite counter is reduced to absurdity, and the problem is, again, with the beginningless past. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, definitely. I remember that. So is the issue supposed to be that there's no reason why he gets to zero now rather than...
I think that's what the issue has to be. I mean, Craig often, I think, overstates what his real point is. I mean, when he starts out, he says, well, there can be no time at which he is counting. And it appears that he's confusing counting infinitely many numbers with counting all the numbers, right? And the response is, well, yeah, he could have finished a moment ago, but he didn't, right? He could have finished 3 moments ago, but he didn't. You know, what is the problem? I mean, you're saying that he would have finished before any given moment. Therefore, he can't be actually counting at any moment. And so we have an absurdity. And I think that putting the argument that way, it clearly has no weight at all. So I think what he's really on about, it becomes clear that what he's really on about is what you said. I mean, it's as if the fact that he's finishing now is a contingent fact that cries out for explanation. And I guess he thinks there could be no explanation. The best version of this argument was suggested to me by somebody other than Craig in correspondence, a guy named Paul Draper. So it's a contingent fact that cries out for explanation, so there could be an explanation, but there couldn't be one. So we have this problem. That is the best way of putting this line of argument that I've come across. I guess my response to that is to say it's way, way too strong to say there couldn't be an explanation. I mean, suppose Jack, we'll call him Jack, is finishing his count up to -1 right now. It seems way too strong to me to say that there could be no explanation. I mean, there could be, this is all very whimsical, but it's all whimsical, isn't it? There could be another infinite counter named Jill, who did in fact finish, right, 1 moment ago. And here's the explanation of Jack. He always checks to see what Jill has just counted and does the next thing. You said, well, you still haven't explained Jill. Well, I'll give you a third infinite counter, Hill, right? And Jill does something similar with Hill. So for each of these infinite counts, there's an explanation. Well, you might say, well, but what about all of them? However many there are, well, at some point, I think there is going to be some brute contingency. I personally think that's unavoidable. I'm not a Leibnizian on this. I think that at some point there's going to be some complex of contingent facts that's just how it is. And there is nothing more to say, and I think that's okay. So no, I don't find the infinite counter number to be awfully persuasive.
I think it seems to me that there's also something wrong with the idea. I mean, maybe it's something like built into counting, which is that even if you're counting down rather than up, let's say, well, yeah, it doesn't really make any difference, does it? If you're approaching zero, or if you're leaving zero behind. I'm not sure I understand the idea of counting without there being the first thing that you've counted. I can start counting from 10, 11, 12, or 1, 2, 3, whatever, but there still has to be a first thing that I'm counting for that to make sense. But in this beginningless counter, part of the problem, it seems to me, is that there's no first thing that they would count, right? Because there's no, it doesn't go, oh, infinity minus 1, right? Because that infinity isn't a number that they start counting from, right? Any that they would be counting from is a finite number. So the idea would be, well, how could they have started counting when, if they've been counting from an infinite number, if every number that they count from is a finite number? So it seems to me that it just rules out, for that reason, the idea of someone having been counting down forever. It doesn't rule out the idea of there being an infinite series of past events, but it just rules out the idea that someone could have started counting, if counting requires a starting point or something. I mean,
if you're right about that, that would just be a fact about counting.
Exactly, yeah. That seems to me that's all that this is.
It wouldn't tell us anything about whether the past has to have a beginning.
So think of this theory, let's call it the moving spotlight theory, right? Which is that the way time works is that there's a line, like the number line, and what happens is that someone is essentially, God or someone is shining a torch on the number line and illuminating a certain section of it. And what he's doing is he's moving the bit that the torch illuminates, the spotlight, gradually up the number line. Now, if that was your theory of time, and maybe that's a version of presentism, because you might say, look, only things that are real are what the spotlight's illuminating or something. And because the past and the future are not currently being illuminated, then they're not currently real, something like that. And now, let's say that you think that the past section of the number line is beginningless. It goes on forever. So the idea would be that the spotlight, no matter how fast it was moving, would never arrive at this point here if there was an already an infinite distance for it to cover. Because no matter how fast it's moving, it would never be able to cover an infinite distance. And there is an infinite distance for it to cover. So it would never get here. It seems to me that that's something like what's going on with this counter idea, which is a bit stronger than the counter, because Craig's at least saying that it could happen that the guy's counting down to zero, and he was just saying there's no explanation why he's counting down to zero. But it seems to me that this way of putting things is stronger, and it fits with Craig's idea of presentism and the asymmetry, right? Which is that, the spotlight's moving in one direction and not the other direction, and that somehow makes a difference here. And if that's right, then if there was a finite amount of distance for it to cover on the line before it got here, then it would be able to get here. And if there wasn't, if it went on forever, it wouldn't be able to get here. And that's basically his objection to the beginningless past. Does that seem right?
It makes sense to me. Craig, I think himself would be very uncomfortable with talking about the moving spotlight view. I think he would think that's a crazy view, and so on, because it has these events out here and the spotlight moving across them. And that would certainly play into the hands of my earlier argument. I'd just say, well, we can count all these events, can't we? I mean, they're countable infinities in both directions. Why aren't they? So I don't think he'd be comfortable with that, but I don't think that gets to the heart of what you're asking about. The assumption would be that the spotlight has to start somewhere.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think the way people talk about the impossibility of traversing the infinite, they do seem to be implicitly supposing something like that it would have to start. It's as if we're standing outside. The race hasn't begun yet, and Achilles hasn't taken his first step, and we're standing outside the series of events, and we have to make a beginning. Or at least I don't know. I think that thought may be built into the idea that a series formed by successive addition is formed. Right? That it isn't really formed unless somehow standing outside the series, something, right, endures through all this time and forms the series by undergoing all of these changes. Sometimes Craig talks about the universe having, undergone all these changes, or having gone through all these states. And I guess I see what you're saying, but I'm inclined to think, this just presupposes that there's not a beginning. Why isn't it enough for the series to be formed by successive addition? Just that each of them happens and each of them occurs after all of the others have happened. Each of them is added to all the ones that have already been added to, all the ones that have already been added to, with no beginning. That's the hypothesis that has to be reduced to absurdity. And I don't see why we don't have a series formed, at least its form is that of successive addition. If you're requiring something extra, then you're implicitly requiring that we be standing outside with the flashlight or doing something, right? And we have to start somewhere. Yeah, but of course, that just assumes a starting point.
Yeah, and we agree that if you have a starting point, it doesn't matter how long you go on for, you're never going to get to infinity. We all agree on that. And then the question is, are you allowed to assume effectively that a beginningless series is absurd because that you have to kind of smuggle in a starting point, basically, and then show that you could never get to this point by successive addition? That's true, but what you're doing is smuggling in there being a starting point and then applying the successive addition principle to show that you could never get here. But if there is no starting point, which is what's under question, then successive addition just turns into what you're saying, which is this kind of general principle that every event follows on from one that comes before it. And if that's all that it means to have successive addition, then there's an infinite amount of successive addition already taking place at every moment. And that seems to fulfill the successive addition premise and not have a beginning. So yeah, it does seem like we're just trading off whether we assume a starting point or not.
Either it fulfills the successive addition requirement despite not having a starting point, or you require a starting point for successive addition, in which case you're begging the question against the beginningless past.
Nice.
That's roughly how it's always seemed to me.
Yeah, that seems exactly how I would see it. Just said more clearly.
Well, I don't know if it's more clear. If I could add one other thought. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that a future series of events, an endless future series of events, is formed by successive addition, at least in the sense that each of them will have succeeded, been added to all the ones that have gone before, that will have gone before. And if that's sufficient for successive addition, and if I'm right in what I said earlier about an endless series being an actual infinite, then there's a temporal series that's actually infinite and formed by successive addition. So in a way, the same issue comes back. Why isn't that an actual infinite that's formed by successive addition? I mean, maybe you just build have been now has been into the concept of successive addition, but that just seems like winning by brute force, by just saying I'm right because I'm right. Yeah. That's how it feels to me. I mean, the thing that makes it. Are you there? Mm-hmm. You froze for just a sec. The the thing that makes it seem plausible to say that any temporal series is formed by successive addition seems to me to be present in the case I'm imagining, where each of the future events, each of which will occur, will have been added to all those that will have occurred. So if an endless series of future events is possible, then even on a dynamic theory of time, I'd say you've got an actual infinity that's formed by success, that has this form of being, that we're describing in the future direction as well.
So again, it seems like the arguments or the considerations tell equally against the actually infinite future as they do against the actually infinite past, unless an asymmetry is just stipulated between the two that sort of makes some kind of difference. And we're not quite sure why that, well, I'm not quite sure whether the right type of asymmetry can be actually justified, or whether it's just a question begging asymmetry, or some kind of ad hoc, yeah, but it's different for that than my case.
There's something to think about there. I'm not sure. One thing that's clear is that, even if you build a starting point into your concept of successive addition, it'll be the case that each finite segment of a beginningless past will have been formed in your sense of successive addition. Now, when confronted with that obvious truth, what Craig always says is that, we're committing the fallacy of composition or something by supposing that because each finite subsegment is formed by successive addition, the series as a whole is formed by successive addition. Yeah, I don't know. It seems to me that you get this result only by saying, yeah, the series as a whole has to have a beginning in order to be formed by successive addition. And the person who thinks that a beginningless series is possible is not going to concede that. So dialectically, it doesn't seem to me that this is the way to go.
Yeah, I'm sure we could sit here and talk about this forever.
For the rest of time, however long that is.
Yeah, keep coming up with objections and counter-objections, successive addition of counter-objections to each previously made objection. But I think it's as good a time as any. It's an arbitrary time. There's no reason why it's this time and not 10 minutes beforehand. But let's call it to a close there anyway, I think. We can always pick this up another day if we need to. So I'd like to say thank you very much, Wes, for coming on and talking to me about the Kalam today. And have you got anything you wanted to promote or anything? There's like a book coming out on this, or you should have a book coming out on this if you don't.
No, not really.
Go on, write a book about it.
Thank you. Pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much.